Welcome to Carte Blanche, the show where candid conversations about a great city and state take center stage. In a well-balanced society, the three branches of government support our civil liberties. The main principles agreed upon hinge around fairness, transparency, independence. So, how is New York faring? I am delighted to welcome a guest who has dedicated his brilliant career to civil liberties and governmental integrity in and out of the courtroom. A legal luminary and founding partner of a law firm that just turned 25. He is one of the fiercest litigators the city has known. Notably, his groundbreaking challenge to the New York City Board of Estimates reshaped the city's governance. The case found its final chapter in front of the U.S. Supreme Court with a stellar victory for our guest, and more importantly, a victory for all New Yorkers. I'm your host, Leila Logizico, and tonight, I am delighted to welcome Richard Emery to talk about our institutions, the balance or imbalance of power, civil liberties at a time when special interests hold more influence and clout than ever, and yes, we will also talk about Penn Station. Stay with us as we give Richard Emery carte blanche. Richard, welcome.
Nice to be here, Leila.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Sure.
I'm really excited to have a conversation with you because you've been at it, meaning, dealing with civil liberties for your entire career.
Mm-hmm.
This was a vocation, I think. Certainly, looking at the span of your career, that's, I think, how people perceive you. How are we doing? How is New York City and New York State doing? Are we doing better than we did in the past? Where are we on civil liberties?
Well, it's a good question. Civil liberties are always challenged by government and large institutions even as well. I think that there was a period during the Giuliani period in particular where it was an all-time low, I would say. The 80s were a very strange period, and the 70s, even late 70s were a very strange period where police were running amok in the city in some sense, but they weren't organized to deprive people of their rights. That happened later, but many people's rights were deprived, and there are many wrongful convictions, and of course, it was based on race. In the 90s, Giuliani organized this in a way that and it wasn't only on the police front at that time. It was certainly the police front to some substantial degree and continued. But it was also other issues, First Amendment issues where the museums, a museum exhibit was the target of Giuliani's wrath. And there were any number of issues where he behaved in an outrageous way. And the courts very much controlled him and backed him off even then. And to some degree that carried over to Bloomberg. Bloomberg was a much more open and transparent mayor on the one hand. On the other hand, the city's poverty issues and race issues are very deeply, deeply embedded. And I'm not so sure they've gotten dramatically better. So there are trends, and I wouldn't say the trend is overall in favor of civil liberties and equality of opportunity and freedom of expression. And the whole migrant crisis is a very sad chapter because it's a...
So I think actually that this is going to be a big test for New York City.
Absolutely, it's a test.
And we already start to see people who call themselves progressives who feel very challenged by the crisis.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point, Leila, because the migrant crisis, in my view, is a huge opportunity for New York City. This city has been created from migrants, from immigrants, and the labor issues and small business issues have always thrived as a result of immigration and people who want to come to this country to make a better life and to really work hard and to have a family life and to have
is New York still a land of opportunity, in your opinion?
I think it is, in fact, I think the reaction of Adams in particular, but also the society as a whole, looking at this as some kind of a crisis rather than an opportunity to integrate people who would really fit well in our society to work and get them jobs. I know the federal government is a bit of an obstacle in that regard, but that actually is, I think, an excuse.
So let me ask you a question, because I think it's fair to say that New York has changed quite dramatically since the Bloomberg years and has dramatically gentrified. With that, has New York's character and identity as being, the land of opportunity for migrants, isn't that what we are, butting against? Has New York become too gentrified to actually see that migrants are an opportunity?
Maybe. It may be that the case, although the wealth gap is probably greater than ever in New York. So
Yeah.
in Brooklyn, it's happening in the Bronx, it's happened in certain parts of Manhattan that were traditionally quite cheap and are no longer so. The demand for housing, of course, is a major issue and continues to be a big problem, which I think is much more easily solved than it's really a problem of regulatory and legal misapplication of various factors that inhibit.
I just want to go back to the housing question, because right now the conversation is very much framed in terms of supply and demand, which undoubtedly supply and demand plays a role. But even Adam Smith, the father of the theory of supply and demand, knew that it does not apply to housing, that it does not apply to land. Land is actually subjected to other economic forces. So how do we think about this issue, and is there a way to actually reframe the narrative so that we're not stuck on, it's supply and demand, and therefore it seems that right now the only answer is we need to build, baby, build?
Well, certainly start with build, baby, build. There's nothing wrong with building in New York. New York has been based on real estate. I mean, real estate and finance are the heart of New York City's economy. And real estate is very important to New York City and has to be encouraged and the like. You saw in the New York Times recently, there were identified locations that could house, could generate buildings for 500,000 people. That's an enormous opportunity in places that have zoning that would allow it now without any variances or anything else.
You and I met because we've been very involved in Penn Station, and more specifically in a plan that was introduced by Governor Cuomo in 2020 that would see the demolition of 8 city blocks, and they would then be encumbered by 10 new super tall buildings. All of this under the guise of fixing Penn Station, whatever that means. That has actually still to this day not really been defined, what is really fixing Penn Station. And the community was absolutely up in arms because it would cause the displacement of many residents, some of them seniors, low income, rent stabilized tenants. This whole thing ended up in the courts. Tell us a little bit about your view on this case, and what is it? Do you think it's the symptom of something bigger?
Well, as you know, I'm one of the lawyers who's litigating on behalf of the community, and also one particular landowner who is being prejudiced by this whole process. And Vornado's deal with ESD, in other words, the governor, really, the Empire State Development entity, is an unholy alliance based, in our view, on a lot of benefits that Vornado was providing to Cuomo and now to Hochul in the context of campaign contributions and the like. And of course, the world changed then. there was an original idea that never could there be too much office space. And now, because of COVID, the idea is that there's a glut of office space and we have to convert it all to residential space, which is actually a very hopeful process. As far as Penn Station is concerned, clearly those buildings will never be built. There may be 1 or 2 buildings at some point. The plan to have a financing of a new Penn Station, because of the tragedy of taking away the old one, which was a magnificent building, is gone by financing it through Vornado. Now it's going to be financed by the government or bonding or some form of normal financing rather than having real estate development finance. And of course, real estate development finances almost everything because of taxes and various other benefits, but it isn't going to be done through a especially favorable deal that Vornado was going to get for these buildings that may or may not have ever been built, and for which there was no schedule for the money to come in to finance Penn Station. So the basic problem with the Penn Station situation now is that there is no vision, really. There is a vision from some European people who propose something. There's a vision from the MTA. Janno Lieber has his own vision, which is at cross purposes with a lot of other people's visions of what should occur. Hochul has no vision whatsoever, just trying to figure out what the path of least resistance is and politically opportunistic for her. And it's a mess. You have 6 entities fighting over Penn Station: Amtrak, New Jersey Transit, MTA, the city, the state. That's 5 of them. There are any number of people. You, for one, and then there's this whole idea of through running, which is a very interesting idea. It appeals to those who know transit, those who know European trains and how excellently the European systems run, and how poorly the American systems run, largely because there's no through running, as compared to Europe, where there's almost universal through running that joins whole systems. The balkanization and the political fiefdoms of New Jersey Transit, the MTA, and the whole system of and Amtrak in particular, having those 3 agree on anything is impossible. Look what happened at Grand Central Station.
Yeah.
In Grand Central Station, they couldn't agree, and they had to build this $13 billion underground boondoggle, which is going to be underutilized. The station above is totally underutilized. That station was built for trains that would go all over the country, and now it just has basically local trains. Yeah. There are tracks that are never used up there, that never required, but because the MTA in the long time, because the Grand Central Amtrak and Grand Central Railroads could not have any agreement with the MTA, they built this boondoggle, which of course was really and
it was entirely mismanaged.
Totally mismanaged. It was supposed to be $2 or $3 billion. It ended up being $13 billion, and they can't even get people to rent the space down there. Yeah. It's.
Have you gone down there?
I have not gone down there because
it's insane. It takes you forever.
The escalators are the longest escalators in the world.
It is so deep.
Yeah.
That it takes you forever.
The only thing it's good for is a bomb shelter, and that's not going to be good for anything anyway.
Oh my God. So politically, what sense can we make of the determination of the governor to keep this GPP plan in the books? Why is she not retiring it?
Well, it is retired, effectively. But
at the same time, it's still there. It lingers, right. And if tomorrow Vornado wants to build those towers, they can.
I think the real motivation for keeping the GPP in effect is the consequence to Vornado, it's a favor to Vornado, because the consequence of abandoning the GPP is that they have to write down a lot of properties because they're subject to zoning again. Under the GPP, zoning is wiped away, and that diminishes the value of the land that Vornado owns, that is valued on their books, and Vornado's in a very difficult financial situation. And if they had to write down the value of all that land, it would have serious consequences to their stock price. And I think simply, my view, I'm very cynical about this, I may be wrong, and it's my opinion, that they are simply, Hochul's just simply doing Vornado a very big business favor by not abandoning the GPP and hurting their books.
Is it the definition of pay to play?
Well, it is certainly appears that way.
And why is it not illegal?
It's not illegal because campaign contributions are constantly provided, and the Supreme Court has allowed this, for people who do business with the people that make the decisions about their business, who are politically elected people who get campaign contributions. It's our system. Our system allows for basically legal graft for people who are running for office, who have power when they gain office over major businesses that make contributions to them. It's very cheap compared to the gains, and that's why there's so much contribution. That's why campaigns are really quite wealthy, because the people who give to campaigns through basically unlimited vehicles now, without after Supreme Court precedent has eradicated the limits on campaign contributions effectively. That's the interesting thing. That is good. It's about New York City, about that we do have in New York City for campaigns a system of public financing, and I've got to say that while I still think campaign contributions result in some undue influence in New York City, because of the matching funds, which is 6 to 1 these days, or 7 to 1, even greater. There's a lot less influence bought in New York City. Public financing works. Voters hate it because they think it's a tax on them, but there's a bigger tax on them if the public officials are giving away the value of the government-controlled assets to private interests.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, in my introduction, I do mention that, that there is, a big influence of special interests. They have a lot of influence. They have a lot of clout. Have we reached a tipping point? Like, do you agree, first of all, and have we reached a tipping point?
Well, I mean, I don't think so. I actually think that the government was much more controlled in other eras of our history. J.P. Morgan, in early Rockefeller, Ford, major figures of the level of wealth of Elon Musk and Bezos and others were always present, except maybe during the Depression, less so, but virtually always present in our system. Historically,
somehow, so it's interesting because somehow I see them as being, still wrapped in the aura of being robber barons, and that therefore the good that they did still offsets a little bit, the influence that they had. And here what I struggle with is that I don't see any baron in any of these special interests. It's like, the rubber ink is pretty obvious.
I think it's more diffuse, but it's also much more transparent. The fact is because of the amount of media which has exploded, and the internet, and the general ability to get information to many people quickly and find out what's going on between private interests and government, we get the perception that there's an awful lot more, whatever you want to say, undue influence, graft, whatever you want to call it. But I doubt that there is. I think there's much less. I think probably straight out bribes were the way of the world prior to the 60s and 70s. And now the bribes in some form take the form of campaign contributions, but it's a kind of diffuse bribery. It's not, you don't get a quid pro quo for a campaign contribution.
Yeah,
and
unless you're a senator from New Jersey, and then you get
then you get it from
bars.
Qatar. Maybe, I don't know. He hasn't been convicted yet.
That's true. That's true. But I mean, we know that he had gold bars in his closet, which that alone is fascinating.
You don't have gold bars in your closet?
In my sock drawer, always.
Right, exactly.
But so it's actually interesting because I think you're making a very good point. Maybe it's because we see it more and there's more access to the information.
It's also why we're more cynical. I mean, we're far more cynical as a society, and the society is more divided than ever, as we know, because we get this onslaught of information every day about horrible things that are happening in our society, all of which happened in the past. It didn't not happen, believe me. It's just that we didn't know about it.
Yeah. So this actually has an influence on people's engagement. I find that people tend to be very cynical. I totally agree with you. And as a result, they tend to often disengage because, the world is so ugly. Politics is so ugly. It's best to disengage. The voter participation is very low.
Yeah.
It has fluctuated lately, but it still remains pretty low. On off years, it's abysmal. Is that a danger?
Oh, of course. Of course, it's a danger. I think the degree to which our public institutions have no support in society, or there's no confidence in public institutions, Supreme Court, for instance, they're all at an all-time low. And that's very depressing and very worrisome. I think it's inevitable in the age of the internet, in the age of competition for information. I mean, my solution is very simple. I just read articles of people I trust. I read virtually nothing where there are predictions of what's going to happen in the future. If you eliminate all the articles that you're bombarded with that talk about what's going to happen in the future rather than what's happening now or in the past, you eliminate about 2/3 or 3/4 of everything you're bombarded with. And by the way, those predictions are no better than mine or yours. And so I just say those people are full of it. And I just read what I think I can trust gives me some hopefully larger perspective on what's going on. And then also not being bombarded by the alerts all the time. I'm still subject to it, obviously, but I try and ignore it as much as possible. And then you live your life in a way where you abide by your own sense of morality, integrity, and values.
So do you have any?
Very few people can do this.
Yeah. But actually, do you have any piece of advice to people on, how to help them restore their faith or cope with in a way that does not lead them to get disengaged?
I wish I had that. I would be, a philosopher king if I knew the answer to that. I think probably that is the question of our time. How do you maintain a sense of equanimity about the future without being engaged? Or if you are going to get engaged, where is it that you can get engaged and make a meaningful difference? I think you're a good example. You're engaging yourself. I think locally is the best way to be engaged. I think, dealing with your own neighborhood, your own people you care about, and your own family, and your own city, and your own block, and your own community is the way to start. And that people can make a meaningful difference at that level.
Yeah.
And then thinking about people who are less fortunate than we are, or who've been traditionally subjugated and oppressed, and trying to do something about problems to remedy the conditions under which those things have happened, race being chief among them, is the key to the future. But this society has, fundamental problems, and they were always there. They were worse, They may be a little better, who knows, but they seem like they're worse now because of all the onslaught of information.
It's the high-speed segment on our show where we get fast and curious. We're gearing up for a rapid-fire quiz with our guest. Richard, you're up for the challenge?
Sure, of course.
Fantastic. So here's the rule. I start the sentence, you finish it.
All right.
So here we go. Open and transparent government is the panacea, but
it also causes people to be reactive in a way that is very problematic for the society as a whole, because you have no perspective. It's just their immediate information is something that people react to, and then it's visceral, it's not thoughtful.
Every elected official claims to be a champion for civil liberties, but
they all have their own interests at heart. And since they are elected and they're part of government, by definition, they're part of the problem.
Dick Ravitch was a beacon, and his death leaves a tremendous void, but
there's no but there. It does. It just simply, he's a tremendous loss. He was an absolutely fantastic man and had great and creative ideas, and he saved New York City at least a couple of times.
Yeah. And the state and the MTA.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. It's such a loss, such a huge loss. But I think he's a beacon.
But the but is that there's no one to replace him.
Yeah. Commissions on government integrity are commendable, but
their work usually ends up behind the radiator.
Everybody agrees that the Penn Station GPP is an abomination, but
for NATO.
Touché. Yeah. The media is an important counterpower, but
causes a lot of the problems that we have in our society today, because people react instead of getting an overview and gaining a thoughtful perspective on what's going on around them.
Civic advocacy and participation are critical, but
there are no buts there. But it should, in my view, be at a local level, as we talked about before, at a level where people can feel they're making a difference. When people go out and help the migrants eat and have opportunities or do translation for them, as friends of mine do on a regular basis, it really is a feeling of accomplishment.
Freedom of speech must be protected, but
it also has enormous downsides and problems. Trump is the perfect example of that. You can't let people run amok in a society that depends on accurate information and not just volatile information and attacks on other people.
Yeah. How do we find the balance on that? Because this is really something incredibly we're put to the test on that.
I mean, the whole Twitter business is a perfect example, and all of the internet entities, the big ones who control a lot of the speech, have to struggle with this more so than government in a way. Government is pretty well regulated by the constitutional principles underlying the First Amendment, but the entities which now control most of the information in society and have more First Amendment issues bubbling out of their activities are themselves have First Amendment rights and First Amendment, if you can put it this way, social responsibilities. How they're going to regulate that, it's a very interesting and problematic issue. They clearly have to. Musk is trying to just allow everything to go, and yet he can't even do that, and it creates an enormous mess. I think that's one of the most difficult problems right now.
And do you feel that our elected officials, and especially in Congress, do you think that they are up to the task?
Clearly not at this moment of regulating these alternative vehicles that have so much First Amendment effect. I mean, in some ways, the defamation and tort principles of law, where private people can have some effect, a deterrent effect on the way it's regulated, might have some effect, but that does not really quell the misinformation. That only really has an effect on the attacks on individuals. The misinformation is really the biggest problem of all.
Yeah. So could it be that, although I take your point that we are in a better, civil liberties climate today than we were in the past, but and a lot of, our institutions have changed so that, we have more rights, we have more access to information. Transparency is greater than it was 10, 20 or 50 years ago. But at the same time, so these tools exist, but if no one is using them, then what good does it do? Which is, goes to the point of these commissions on government reform that, as you said, often end up behind the radiator. How do we bridge that? Because, I certainly applaud these initiatives. It's great to have a commission on, the Sunshine Law, but what good does it do if, in the end, even if recommendations are made and adopted, but then no one uses them?
Well, obviously, a sense of people being involved in the process, not only in the outcome, is helpful. If it gets the right kind of publicity and the right kind of the right kind of influence on elected officials. But really, what the norms are in society end up being the most important factor. And are people going to believe that it's good to let the governor who gets all these campaign contributions decide what happens at Penn Station, or should there be some restraint on that process? Are people going to believe that the courts are fair and just, and rather than influenced by whatever interests conservative conservative or progressive or liberal, based on who appointed judges, and the judges are simply more political actors? It all depends on whether there's a sense of confidence.
Yeah.
I mean, young people shutting off and cutting themselves off, or living only on social media, of very selected portions of social media, is a terrible thing.
Yeah. It's very easy to just get locked up in a bubble.
I understand it. I understand the.
So you're in the courtroom quite often. Obviously, you're a litigator. You've been in various courtrooms at various levels. In the state of New York and elsewhere. What is your view of our court system? Let's start just with the New York. Let's start with the New York City benches. Civil Supreme. Do we have good judges?
I think we have amazingly good judges. I think judging is a calling. It's a calling. It's the secular clergy of our society. They have enormous respect from certainly lawyers and even still the society at large, and certainly the people who come before them, because of their enormous power, give them a lot of respect. And I think quite often, more often than not, they earn it. They take their jobs very seriously. Judges work incredibly hard for the most part, and they really care about doing justice for the people that come before them. That's why they're there. If they have views of society. Clearly, they're influenced by their own life experience. Clearly, they're influenced by their view of what is good policy to some degree, even though they're not supposed to be in principle. They're supposed to just decide based on the precedent. That's a mythology, but everybody understands that. But I do think judges, for the most part, and I teach a course in judging, and we talk to judges very intimately in that course because they come and talk to our students. Judges are very high-minded people, and they really care about not only the litigants in front of them, but what it means to decide and the ways they decide. I have a very high regard for judges. And even conservative judges with whom I disagree, I think are trying to do the job that they're given.
Do you think, so in New York City, we elect our judges. Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing?
We don't really elect our judges in New York City. That's a mythology. The political leaders appoint judges who run for election without any opposition. So, I mean, the practicalities are the political leaders appoint the judges. Upstate, there are contested elections. Upstate, there are real elections. I don't think the elective system is the best one because it's very political, and judges then have to go hat in hand to get elected, and that's not a great thing. I think that, but I think most of them, once they're elected, because they're usually elected to either very long terms or they take the job very seriously, I think they rise above the political process for the most part. There are exceptions, but I think for the most part, judges really do become seriously committed to the job that they're supposed to be doing, whether they're elected or appointed. I think an appointed system also has the same kind of influence, embedded in it, or some similar influences embedded in it. But for the most part, I would say appointed judges are generally have better credentials. They have better qualifications than elected judges. Elected judges often are people who are in the political system primarily instead of in the legal system primarily.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, and I think you make a very, very good point. So, pivoting a little bit, we've talked a lot about our civil society, and as part of it, we have in New York City some really very robust civic organizations. One of them being the City Club, which, with your blessing, I became the president not too long ago. You've been a member of the City Club for a long time. And before that, I think you've been very closely associated with the Municipal Art Society. Tell us your views on, this part of our society. What kind of role do they play? And have you seen a change over time?
We can speak out on things, which I think is good. And I think we can do policy things about zoning and development and preservation and those things. We can lobby to some degree. But I think the instinct of both the Municipal Art Society and the City Club has been preservation and controlling overdevelopment, which now is a little easier in the office space, but obviously in the residential space, there's an enormous incentive and opportunity for development. So, I think the high-end development, to the degree to which it's depriving the city of affordable housing, is something that we should be continuing to do, and also just preserving the West Side. We ended up being very influential over the park, all up and down the West Side, and we're influential in the High Line, and we've been influential on a number of very important preservation issues that I think are to have that voice in New York City is important, because a lot of New York City's best qualities are from its history and from its culture. And that is most often preserved by preservation efforts. Not exclusively. Obviously, development is a good thing, but the right kind of development is a good thing.
Do you feel that these historic civic organizations are losing turf? And I'm not specifically one or the other, but there seems to be a new brand of advocacy that is very, very aggressive and has a very different outlook. YIMBYs, they call themselves. Yes, in my backyard.
Right.
Do you see this as a turf war?
I'm not sure there's a trend one way or the other. I think these are ad hoc based on particular projects or particular initiatives. Obviously, the profit motive in development is the major driving force, and whether a community is going to have much influence on that really depends on how organized and financially capable that community is, and whether there's also been zoning or other restrictions that are enforceable in the system, or whether there are going to be variances and changes by virtue of the power of development. So I wouldn't say there's a trend one way or the other. Obviously, development is the lifeblood in many respects of New York City, but responsible development is different from just out of control development.
And are we winning on this front?
It's hard to say. I don't think so. I think Central Park South and the super talls are a blight in one sense, but that's just my aesthetic opinion. Almost every city in the world has these buildings. I think we were late to the party on these buildings, if you will. A lot of people would say New York is behind the curve on a lot of the development issues. The idea of warehouse departments by rich people is just unbearably
What do you mean by saying New York is late to the party? Meaning that other cities have embraced the super tolls and New York is
if you look around the world,
yeah,
many major cities, certainly in the Far East, certainly in the Middle East, and even in Europe, have many more super tolls than New York.
Yeah, but what I find interesting is that if you take a city like Dubai, Dubai actually is totally shit. I mean, they were like crazy for the tallest. It was like, to the stratospheric levels.
Right.
And they've actually totally slowed down. The latest is actually a development in Dubai is a fairly low scale, more European type of urban design.
Right.
I mean, I was involved in the super tall fight. I think that it goes beyond just the aesthetics. What it causes to the park, the shadows that it casts on the park, it makes the park less usable.
Right.
I think this is real. This is real, very bad urban planning and urban design. And
well, I think also it's disgraceful that these are really just lock boxes in the sky, where people are investing, thinking that these are good things for the long term, and they're basically empty. Most of those apartments
are empty, so they're not. It's not housing. They actually to get them built, a large number of dwelling units were eliminated. These buildings were rental buildings that were torn down to make way for these super tolls. I actually really resent them. I really resent them. I find that beyond just the aesthetics, they actually are a huge problem. And the part that I really resent the most is that I never blame developers. Developers know very well what their job is, the bottom line, and that's the only thing that matters to them. And they do a jolly good job. But our elected officials are not quick enough to actually put new zoning or new laws in the books that can address that. And this is where I'm really chagrined that, the city, when these towers were going up, and it was a large number of them, it was not just one, and you're like, oh, okay, well, maybe we can live with it. They did not react. And to this day, we don't have any zoning tool in the toolbox that would prevent that from happening.
Right. Well, the engineering is a big factor. It never used to be possible to build these things. And now height is apparently no object with the engineering skills and developments that exist. I don't love them at all either. I think that the city would be much more, it would be better served by different development, but that doesn't happen when you have a capitalist system and you have campaign contributions, and elected officials aren't going to control these sorts of developments that obviously make money.
Yeah.
You also have a tax base. I mean, there is the argument that we collect taxes on a lot of that. I don't think we collect near enough, and we've given away a lot of tax breaks on some of these developments, which
Most
is
of them
disgraceful.
were built under the 421A,
Right.
so they were tax exempt.
Yeah.
And then, to add insult to injury, because this kind of dwelling unit does not exist elsewhere, and certainly not on the rental market, and because the tax base is assessed on a comparable rental, they basically assess them against like a 2-bedroom on the Upper West Side.
Well, but the property tax system in this city, if you want to pick a single thing that is desperate for reform and that every public official should be in favor of reform because it can finance government not only more fully but equitably, it's the tax system. And there's litigation about the tax system. There are commissions now looking at the tax system, property tax system. There are lots of proposals. But obviously, that's something that Albany has to be weighing in on. And it's a very complicated problem with lots of vested interests. Obviously, the condos and the co-ops are in competition with the rental properties, in competition with the home ownership more generally, and businesses. And so you have a very thorny problem.
Yeah.
I think the tax reform, which in New York City is key because almost all of the revenue, not all of it, but a very substantial part of the revenue, I think the majority of the revenue is property taxes.
Yeah. We here at Carte Blanche love a good pole dancing session, and no, I am not referring to intricate dance moves by scantily clad dancers. It is time for that segment where we dip into the world of opinion surveys and polls. So, Richard, I wanted to get your take on a survey that was actually commissioned by the Pew Center, and that basically shows that public trust in government is at the lowest. Only 2 out of 10 people have trust in the federal government. What do you make of that?
I must say that I never read polls. First of all, polls are notoriously idiotic these days because they have to do it through cell phones. And then how do you get cell phone numbers? And it's not done like it used to be done, where you could really tell where the recipient or the response was. But assuming that there is a lack of confidence in the federal government, which I certainly think there is, and 2 out of 10 may be the right number. I don't know whether that's true or not. Again, it's too vague. Confidence in the federal government, I don't know what that means. You mean confidence? Of course, I don't have confidence in the federal government in their defense spending. I don't have confidence in the federal government to assure quality of opportunity in lots of areas of the government and enforcing the laws of the civil rights laws. I don't have confidence in the government in foreign policy in many respects, in the way that we're handling crises abroad. Some of them I do, some of them I don't. But I have a lot of confidence in Joe Biden. I think he's probably the best president we've had during my lifetime.
Say more about that.
Well, I think his policies and his judgment are virtually flawless. I think the border is a huge problem, but it's a problem he inherited, and it's an incredibly thorny problem. I don't know how anybody would handle it really that in an effective way. And I think his flight from Afghanistan, of course, which is viewed as a failure, was inevitable, because whenever we get out of a country where we've been for 20 years embedded, it's going to be a disaster, and we're going to leave a lot of tragedy behind. We inflicted the tragedy in the first place, in many respects, at least. And another flight of fancy of wasted taxpayer money, just like Iraq and Afghanistan, were the money that we spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, if it were put into housing in the United States, we'd have no migrant problem. We'd have no problem of any sort. If we put it into education, we wouldn't be 40th in the world or thereabouts in educational accomplishment. The ability of the government to waste money on foreign escapades is incredible. But I think Biden's judgment overall has been really very good, very moderate, very reasonable, very pragmatic, and the fact that we the fact that we navigated an economy that was post-COVID, where there was a huge inflation, and then an infrastructure bill, which is an amazing accomplishment, and coming out of it without any kind of economic reversal of anything, that there's low employment and very high wages overall in this country right now, is, I think, attributable to the way he's handled it under adverse circumstances, where everybody's criticizing him, where everybody is trying to sabotage what he does.
So just to go back to what you were saying in the the lack of trust that you have in certain policies, is it fair to say that do you have mistrust, or do you disagree?
Look, I hope I'm being realistic, but I think it's very hard to be a government. Governing is incredibly difficult, let alone governing when two sides are diametrically opposed, and one of them, the very far right wing, well, the left wing of the Democratic Party is very self-destructive, and the right wing of the Republican Party is generally bent overtly on sabotaging any kind of progress. But at the same time, I don't know that there's any better system that I would concoct. Yeah, there are a lot of reforms I would make if I could, but do you have
trust in our institutions?
Not if they allow a dictatorship to occur, which might happen next if they don't control Trump and what's going to happen next. I mean, for instance, the Supreme Court. I'm quite sure the Supreme Court is going to allow Trump to be on the ballot. A real leadership, proper Supreme Court role would be to keep him off the ballot, because that's what the court is supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be enforcing the Constitution, and the Constitution does not allow an insurrectionist to go on the ballot. And nobody understands. They say it's anti-democratic to kick him off the ballot, but that's just wrong. It's not. It may be anti-democratic, but it's certainly constitutionally mandated, in my view. And what's going to happen now is that the Supreme Court is going to abdicate its responsibility. Now, that's very depressing and very sad. And maybe it is that our governing institutions now are also being terribly bombarded by this kind of division and the kind of immediacy and reactivity of the society, largely because of the information, as we've talked about it in the past. So yes,
is it that access to the ballot is a sacrosanct thing, and that therefore, even if he is an insurrectionist, we should turn a blind eye? I mean, that's the case that Dershowitz is making. That basically ballot access is just more important.
Well, you don't have access to the ballot if you're under 35 for the presidential ballot. You don't have access if you're not a citizen, that you haven't been born in the United States. There are qualifications. And Congress, when it passed the 14th Amendment during the Civil War, right after the Civil War, 1866 or 67, I think it was, made it very clear. I mean, it was an amendment to the Constitution that that the insurrectionists, and there was a process to get out of it. If Congress voted them exempt from the prohibition, they could then get on the ballot and they could run for office and they could hold office. But if Congress didn't, then they couldn't. And unless Congress says that Trump has access to the ballot, it seems to me you couldn't have a more clear case of insurrection with the fake electors and with the January 6th riots, which he encouraged.
So I know that you don't like to read any reporting on predictions, but I'm sure people want to hear your predictions.
Oh, I think it's going to be a nightmare. It's going to be a nightmare of barrage of media that is crying wolf and histrionic and just calamity-laden information left and right. And that for the public, for me, for you, it's going to be very hard to keep an even keel. it's going to be very hard not to be just walking around feeling battered by what we are going to be hearing all the time in these primaries, the primary season, the court proceedings, all of which are interlocked with the primary proceeding. Whether Joe Biden is going to run for president after the convention. I mean, he can, in the convention, he could anoint someone else in the convention if he wanted to, as late as July or August, whenever it is. There are just any number of things that can happen this year, let alone in Ukraine and in Gaza.
Yeah. Well, I think that, as you said, that there is sort of like hyper-reactivity that makes us lose sight of the fact that actually things have improved. I think it's
in some ways they have, in some ways they're very threatened.
And I think you're leaving us with also a hopeful message of reminding us that in 50 years ago things were worse, just that we didn't know as much.
That's certainly true. And the hyperreactivity is the threat to making things worse.
In a way, Richard, you're leaving us with actually a positive note on the fact that things were probably much worse 50 years ago. It's just that we didn't know that much,
or we were in a sense of denial because white wealthy people were always in a very good space and put it out of their minds that there were so many people that were not living a life that was as good as ours is, and that was a kind of self-delusion. Now we all know what is around us because we have so much information about it, and we are trying to struggle with problems that existed for all the past and have now are at the forefront of trying to make a difference in a lot of the areas that we just ignored in the past and didn't know about in the past.
Yeah, no, very, very true. And
Yeah.
you've been someone who has tremendously helped New York. Your accomplishments are significant, and I think that New York is grateful for all the work that you've done. Well, thank you so much, Richard, for joining Carte Blanche. Thank you. And that's all for us today. Thank you all for joining us on Carte Blanche. You can find Carte Blanche on Instagram, X, TikTok, and Facebook. Follow us to get updates on upcoming episodes and exciting behind-the-scenes moments. Together, we can shape the future of our city. So until next time, keep the dialogue going, and remember that here on Carte Blanche, the stage is always set for unscripted conversations. Good night.